Let's start. Hello, everyone. My name is Adel Abdelghaffar. I'm the Director of the Foreign Policy and Security Program here at the Middle East Council. It's a pleasure to bring you this timely webinar in partnership with the Hassan Fares Institute at the American University of Beirut. للاستماع باللغة العربية ممكن تنقي Arabic language translation. انقروا هيكون في ترجمة فورية من خلال Zoom. On March 10th, the world woke up to the announcement of a normalization deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This in itself is quite significant, given that both sides have engaged in proxy warfare across the region and have backed opposing sides. But what made the announcement even more important that it was brokered by China. China has actually been engaged in mediation efforts across the region over the years on Palestine and Israel, on Sudan and South Sudan, as well as in Syria, but none really borne fruit as this mediation deal has. So this is actually a big win for Chinese diplomacy. Having said that, how much credit does China deserves remains a big question, given that actually both sides have been engaged in talks and discussions over the past 2 years, especially in Baghdad, Amman, and in Muscat. Nonetheless, this is a pretty significant deal, and we will be feeling its consequences over the next weeks, months, and years. So, what do each of the three parties have to gain from the deal, and how will it impact regional flashpoints like Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon? How is the deal perceived by the US amidst growing China-US competition? And what are the limitations of the deal, and what could be its spoilers? So to answer some of these questions and more, we have partnered with the Hassan Fares Institute to bring you this fantastic panel. With us today is Joseph Bahout, the director of the Hassan Fares Institute, Faisal Abbas, the editor-in-chief of the Arab News, Luciano Zaccara, research professor at Qatar University's Gulf Studies program, and Anna Jacobs, senior analyst for Gulf states at the International Crisis Group. In terms of the session today, each of our speakers will have about 7 minutes for a first round of comments, then a second round of comments of 7 minutes, then we'll go to the audience for questions. If you have any questions, please type them in. I will endeavor to give them to our speakers, and also all of the questions that we have received via email, we have those on with us as well. Without further ado, Joseph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Adel, and thank you very much for the Middle East Council. I'm very happy, and I'm proud also that this is our first joint event after we have signed an MOU a few weeks ago. So I'm very happy for that. Mabruk to all. Adel, I will focus mainly on the impacts and the significations. I mean, the significance of this deal or agreement or understanding or rapprochement. I think we still don't know how to call it on the regional and international level, but also I will say very quickly a few words on the deal itself. First, let me say without exaggeration that this is a turning point if the deal or this rapprochement is consolidated. We will talk about the if probably, but if so, I think it's a relatively big game changer in the geopolitics of the region and maybe in the geopolitics of the world. Now, this agreement itself, I will for sure let Mr. Abbas and others talk about Saudi calculus and the Iranian calculus. But let me first remind our audience that this deal has a sequence. I think if I read it well, we have 2 months of confidence building testing in Yemen. So this is the first theater to watch. And after that, we will have the unraveling of consequences, probably on Iraq, on Syria, and on Lebanon. We'll probably talk about this later on in the session. So there is a phasing and there is a period of probation where both parties will very closely monitor the behavior of the other. So it's not a done deal completely, but it is something that is now on tracks. Now, a few points on what does it mean for the region and for the world, and here I'll have a series of questions. First of all, it's very obvious that what happened in Beijing didn't start in Beijing. It has started a few years ago, maybe in Oman and then in Baghdad, in Iraq. And the two countries, Saudi Arabia and Iran, in the text of the agreement have thanked both countries. So already we have a big question about this kind of hidden diplomacy, its chances of success, how will it go on, and on which files will it go on? For example, 2 days ago, we heard that Iraq was ready to replicate this kind of meeting between Egypt and Iran. Oman will also host some intelligence meeting. So this is something I think that is putting in place a new pattern in the region. The second big question is related to what we have forgotten with Iran, namely the JCPOA. What is the role of the JCPOA in all this? Is this agreement a sort of substitute by both Iran and Saudi Arabia for the lack of JCPOA for a while, if not forever? I don't know. Maybe this is a way of quelling on the regional level sources of tension, of buying insurance policies for both. And this is, and I'm here maybe digressing to something more global, I'll come to it in a minute, is ushering to also the retreat or the retrenchment of the American, let's say, leverage in the region, if the JCPOA is to be buried by this agreement, and this is a question. The third question, you alluded to it, and here we start talking about the quote-unquote spoilers. What does it mean for Israel? If you monitor the very immediate reactions in Israel after the announcement of the deal, it was, you can say it was a sort of panic. A panic because, first of all, Akid, for sure, from the opposition side, it meant that Netanyahu didn't see it coming, but this, I think, is an accusation that is internal politics in Israel. But the main reason for panicking is that the entire construction of the Abraham Accords seen by Israel, I underline this, seen by Israel, was to create a wall against Iran. So this is creating a huge breach in this wall. And I think that today the question, and I hope that Dr. Abbas will answer it, is shedding a big question or putting a big question on whether the steps towards normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel still have the same incentives. I think it will happen, but probably the incentivization will be slightly different. And this is a question also to keep in mind. The other question, I wouldn't put it under the spoilers, but even so, you mentioned, and this is one of the questions that arrived, is the link to the United Arab Emirates. We have noted recently that there is a sort of, let's say, irritant or tension between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. It's not a rift. I don't call it this way. It has to do with Yemen. It has to do with OPEC. It has to do with business, with the role in the region. I think that the tandem Saudi Arabia Emirates is still a solid one, but however, nevertheless, it's notable that until today, at least, the UAE is still aside of this dynamics of full-fledged normalization with Iran, even though the UAE has already made steps in the years behind us towards Tehran. But this is, I think it came as a surprise for the rulers of the Emirates. Now, I'm leaving aside the reverberation on other files in the region. I'll talk about Lebanon in a second round, the consequences on Iraq, on Syria, on the normalization with Syria. We're hearing increasing sounds from Saudi Arabia towards a rapprochement with Syria or a normalization. I think this deal ushers a certain acceleration of that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is the case. I'll end on the main point internationally, and you alluded to it. Whatever the assessment of what happened, I think it highlights at least two things. First of all, it highlights a sort of American, I would say, apathy or passivity or sense of being, let's say, crossed over by this. Of course, the State Department could say we were put in the picture by the Saudis. It's not a surprise, but they didn't tell us exactly what was happening. I think they were surprised, or at least they are taken aback by that. And they are now probably, most probably preparing some, let's say, adaptation to that. I wouldn't say answer. Now, paradoxically, the US is not a complete loser in that, because if there is a dynamics of de-escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, if this could lead to a sort of normalization of Iran, its integration in the classical game of nations, of course, one of the aims of the US would have been attained, the cost being that it's not attained through Washington. And this is, I think, the first issue. The second issue is that we were all waiting for China to become a first-rank player in the Middle East, something like in 2015, in 2050 or 2045 or something like that. In the meantime, we were all in agreement that China is a main economic, energetic, technological player in the region, but no one was expecting that China would become all of a sudden in one night a huge power broker in the region. This is a sign of assertiveness. I don't know if it is related to what's happening in Ukraine, but probably yes. But with this assertiveness, and this will be my last comment, comes a huge burden and responsibility, because now China, Beijing has put itself as a guarantor of something quite big, quite complicated and very risky. The gains and the chances for gains are enormous, but the risks of also being entangled in the muds of the Middle East that the United States are trying to extricate themselves of are also beginning to probably become something China will have to worry about. I'll stop here and probably I'll talk more about some specific regional aspects in a later round. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joe. And you actually hit the nail on the head. China put itself as a guarantor. So what happens next is quite important. Can China guarantee Iran's behavior in the region? And this could be its own spoiler for the deal itself. But we can unpack that a bit later, of course. I'll go to you, Faisal. Please give us some reactions from Saudi and how you see the deal unfolding.
Thank you, Abdulghaffar Adel, and thank you, Joseph, for the excellent introduction. You asked for a reaction in Saudi. I can't help but do this. This is the Arab News today, and we are wishing our readers happy Nowruz, so you can tell what the vibe is here. But I would like to take that actually and say this is not new. In fact, I remember in the first week of March of 2020, just before the pandemic was announced and we were all forced to go into lockdown, very few people noticed that there was a Persian cultural soiree in the ancient Saudi city of Al-Ula. And of course, being in the media, I know very well that there were weeks of discussions before that event was launched or approved to proceed, given that the tensions between Riyadh and Tehran were at their peak. Obviously, there would have been a possible backlash by trolls on social media and the likely politicization of the event. Nevertheless, the event went on. A bold decision was made for it to happen, and Saudi media, including Arab News, was actually invited to cover. And this was a symbolic, I think, action to show to prove a point. Saudi Arabia doesn't have an issue with the Persian culture or with the people. For the past 40 years or so, the whole issue has been the aggressive expansionist policies of the Iranian regime. This comes to no surprise as no surprise to the audience that is here today. You're not waiting for me to tell you that the official mandate of the regime in Tehran was to export the revolution, to destabilize the region, and to undermine Saudi Arabia in particular. So over the past 4 decades, the region was plagued with wars, consequently extremism, and a massive cost in both repair bills and wasted opportunities. But 10 days ago again, and today is Nowruz, which incidentally means in Persian a new day. So we are actually living in a new day, or a dawn of a new day for the whole region, a possible new day for the region. I note that both my previous 2 speakers, Dr. Adel and Dr. Joseph, spoke about, emphasized the if. And I can assure you, this is also in every article that I've read or written myself. Everybody is saying if Iran sticks to the deal. But nevertheless, the question here becomes whether or not it was pursuing, despite all the doubts that are naturally available, because the Iranian regime is not known to stick to deals, unfortunately. However, there's a few factors here that I would like to highlight, which again, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. But there are what I call the two-factor authentication of this deal. The two-factor authentication is both Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. And I'll tell you why. The government in Tehran has been used to dealing with either democracies in the West that change every 4 years, or Saudi leadership that comes in old and doesn't last, and then they reset the conversation and they start all over again. The second part of the two-factor authentication is the Chinese involvement. And again, Dr. Joseph spoke a lot about China's role and what's at stake with China. Now, allow me to go into a little bit about the Chinese-Iranian relationship. And, Dr. Adel, you started by saying, we should not give, or maybe China shouldn't get all the credit because this conversation started 2 or 3 years ago in Iraq. The Iraqi government at the time, I have to say, poured their heart into it. They tried night and day to make this happen. However, and I particularly have to give credit to Prime Minister Al-Kadhimi, who I would say took the matter personally and tried very hard. However, we have to call a spade a spade. Iraq doesn't have leverage over Iran, but China definitely has leverage over Iran. The Chinese, the Iranians, as you know, don't have many friends in the international community. It wouldn't be an exaggeration if I said that their only 2 friends are the Russians, who currently have their hands full, and the Chinese. The Chinese provide them with nuclear technology, with weapons. They are their biggest trading partner. They've invested hundreds of billions of dollars in the Iranian oil and gas. Point is, they can put leverage. They can use this leverage with China. What the Chinese initiative was brought to the Saudi leadership during President Xi's last visit to Riyadh in December of 2022, and the conversation from a briefing that I had would have went something like this. The Chinese presented themselves as a mediator, and the Saudis responded saying that, given that the interests are aligned, we trust that China can be a good mediator in this position, and provided the Chinese with a whole dossier of the previous rounds of talks and a list of grievances. Now, given that China imports around 1.7 to 2 million barrels of oil a day, there is a national interest for China for this deal to work. It's not just about China's soft power or positioning in the world, that they are a peacemaker or that they are that they managed to negotiate this deal. But my understanding is the conversation from our side was saying, look, these 2 million barrels of oil a day, your factories are at risk, your production lines are at risk, your trade is at risk, and it's not because of us, it's because of your friends in Iran. The shipments to the region, the products that you sell to the region, are at risk, not because we are intercepting your ships or causing trouble in the Strait of Hormuz or in the Gulf or in the Red Sea. It's because of Iran and its militias. So it was made very clear, what the grievances were and how solving this is actually in Chinese interest. Not to mention that you have 4 dysfunctional Arab countries, which can all be massive markets if they are functioning properly for the Chinese products, these being Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. So the briefing, I'm gonna, I'll tell you, I'll answer some of the questions raised before by Dr. Joseph. The briefing, as far as I understand, confirms a story that was given by Reuters that by last September, the Iranian leadership had reached a frustration point with the isolation, and they reached out to the Chinese. The deal that was discussed over 5 days in Beijing, and here you have to give the Chinese credit for their efficiency. So they came in December. In March, after 5 days of continuous negotiation, there were main 3 pillars that were discussed. The mutual respect for sovereignty of regional countries, the restoration of development, the restoration of diplomatic ties within 2 months. This is both, to quote my previous speaker, to have the trust building process, but also the logistics of actually allocating diplomats and sending them over back to their respective embassies. And third is the revival of previous agreed treaties between Iran and Saudi Arabia, including trade and a 2001 mutual security agreement, which was signed by the late Saudi Interior Minister Prince Naif and his counterpart at the time, Rouhani. Among other details that were revealed that are of a lot of interest is there is a bilateral commitment of non-aggression, including cyber, military, and intelligence, as well as not assisting any third party to attack another country, whether from your grounds or not. Of course, to sum it up, what this means is better late than never realization in the region. Of course, it took everybody by surprise, and by say everybody, I mean everybody, because as far as I understood, this was kept at a very high senior level. It means that perhaps Iran have realized that they've reached a point where they cannot continue in this isolation and continue to be at odds with all their neighbors. In our case, we have a lot to celebrate. Because as Sun Tzu says in the Art of War, which to disarm your opponent without fighting is the utmost skill, or the best wars are won without fighting. A lot of people are speculating, who won or who lost. Look, I'll talk in facts, and as you know, facts are stubborn things. We are on track to become the fastest growing G20 economy this year. The Entertainment Authority just yesterday released figures that since 2019 until the first quarter of this year, that's including a year and a half of lockdown, we've had 120 million visitors to entertainment events organized by the Entertainment Authority. According to Ipsos, we have the second happiest country in the world. In terms of the happiness index. So we are on track to achieve the goals and, well, a lot of the goals of Vision 2030. And none of these can be achieved if we have the risk of missiles and drones attacking our oil fields, attacking our cities, and hitting our civilians. So for us, this is a big win because it can secure this track to 2030, which is not only good for Saudi's citizens, but as you know, we are building giga projects and giga cities. There's a lot of talent, including the world's best football player, who is now in Saudi Arabia being part. I mean, I know this is going to start another controversy, whether it's Messi or Ronaldo, so we decided, I think, to solve it. What I'm hearing is even Messi might be joining soon, but that's a discussion for another day. But in general, the last thing I would say, and I realize I might have went a bit over time, but there is a lot to celebrate and a lot to be optimistic about if Iran sticks to its part of the deal.
Great, thank you very much, Faisal. And actually answered many of the questions that some of our attendees are asking about how much credit does China deserve? And there's a lot of questions coming in on the durability of this deal. So we'll keep the durability question for everyone towards the end. But now I just want to move to Luciano. I know, Luciano, you're a close follower of Iranian affairs. I want to understand the Iranian perspective, why Did they agree to this now? What are the domestic factors pushing for it? What are the regional factors pushing for it as well? The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this debate. First of all, I always have to say that every deal that is reaching or trying to solve an issue or to reach some kind of peace is much better than not having any deal, and we need these kind of agreements in the region, despite the fact that, as we all already know, this deal is not something very new and something original and something that's going to be a breakthrough agreement that is going to change the whole region. As we already mentioned, this agreement is, I mean, the main statement, trilateral statement made the other day in Beijing. The first thing that called our attention is that they are retrieving the agreement that was signed in 2001, that was part of the negotiations that started in 1998 when Mohammad Khatami was the president in Iran. The fact that Shamkhani, the head of the National Supreme Security Council, was the one that signed this agreement. Bearing in mind that he was the Minister of Defense during the times of Khatami, is giving you the idea that we are coming back to 20 years back, when Khatami arrived to power, and he tried to portray a new foreign policy towards the G states, claiming that Iran was not a threat anymore, that they didn't want to export the Islamic Revolution to the G states, and at the end of the day that Iran needed to coexist with the G states in a region that is already complicated, that didn't need much more complications. This also gives you an idea that how are the things inside Iran right now. The fact that it was the visible head of all these negotiations, not only this one, but the conversation that the Iranians are having in Emirates, and also the recently border treatment that was signed in Iraq, was done by Ali Shamkhani. So it's the security head of the Supreme Council that is making those agreements that includes investment or future investment from both Saudi and Emirates in Iran, which is not precisely someone that is coming from the Raisi administration. So it seems that there is something there that is showing that that there is something going on in terms of what are the trust deposited in terms of dealing with the regional partners. Even though this is, of course, supporting the idea that Raisi, when he started his presidency, claimed he didn't want to have any or zero problem with the neighbors, and continuing the negotiations with Saudi Arabia was one of his main goals. We have to bear in mind also that Raisi was still pushing for look to the East policy. So bearing in mind, meaning that all the efforts of Iran would be to cope with the sanctions and the lack of or the isolationism that is under since the Trump sanctions were applied, and China and Russia were the main targets for this diplomatic approach. That said, Iran decided to sign this deal. I mean, the negotiations, as we all said, started a long time ago, almost 2 years ago. The fact that they were signed in China in 5 days means that all the negotiations, all the core of the negotiation was done before. Even some conditional agreements that started to be done in Yemen were done before the signature of this deal. So my take is that what was decided in China was not that important. Everything was pre-cooked before the two signatories arrived to Beijing. But of course, the main reason for Iran to sign this deal is because the main target was to break this isolationism that Iran has been subject to. Iran lives in this region that needs to deal with the neighbors. Iran has been claiming since the times of Khatami that they don't want to have any problems with the neighbors. Also because any gain in foreign policy represents an internal security reassurance. I mean, if you don't have problems with your neighbors, the survival of your political system will be more or less guaranteed. You will have less trouble with minorities that can be spoiled by neighbors, or things that can be used against you by a foreign power. At least this has been always the behavior of the regional powers. What gains Iran can have from this agreement? First of all, showing that Iran has having, since Raisi arrived to power, a very active diplomacy aiming at solving bilateral issues with all the GCC states. The fact that they signed with Emirates and Saudi, and nowadays we heard that also they are about to sign or to normalize relations with Bahrain as well, is a proof of that. The promise that some investment can come from both Emirates and Saudi to Iran in order to improve the impoverished economic system, and mainly investment in the oil sector that is under heavy sanctions, can also help Iran to detach from help coming from Russia or from China. So it's not a secret that Iran also as Faisal said, they have good friends in Russia and China, but they prefer to have good friends in the region and mainly investment from the Western countries. This investment will not come, so why not investment from the region itself? The possibility that both Iran and Saudi Arabia can join other organizations like the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement organization can give us a prospect of future or further cooperation in other environments that can crystallize in something that is making this peace or this truce to last a little bit longer, even though I still claim that nothing very original has been signed until now. My last point that I wanted to reflect here in this first round is that despite the fact that, as I said before, every time there is this kind of agreement, there are concessions and both actors gain something. I think that what the most important thing that we need to consider in this case is that at Iran, the end of the day, Iran managed to make their deterrence capability to work in terms of diplomatic gains. The fact that in 2019, 2020, we almost have a war in the region, the fact that Iran was investing to some extent in Yemen in order to affect or to harm Saudi Arabia is part of these negotiations that took place since 2019, 2020 until now. The fact that Saudi Arabia decided to accept these negotiations as well is a show that it's an evidence that the deterrence capability of Iran increased in the region, that the leverage that Iran is having in the region in order to achieve diplomatic goals is working. So despite the fact that Iran is still under sanctions by the US or by the European Union or by eventually by the international community, regional objectives have been achieved more than anybody else. So I don't know if I have 1 more minute or no, or if you want to leave it for—
Go ahead for a minute, exactly 1 minute, please.
Since everybody talk about the spoilers, I would say that everybody can be a spoiler here. Israel, the United States, Iran, Saudi, or even China. If nobody managed to, I mean, if Iran or Saudi managed, none of them managed to comply with what they agreed, or the other perceives that they are not doing what they agreed, it will be very difficult to determine if Iran is doing what they promised to do, because we don't know what is the content of the deal so far. We don't know if Saudi will do it or not. China, I think all of us can agree that will not be the guarantor of this agreement in terms of enforcing what it was signed, but also Israel or the US can be also a spoiler. I mean, we don't know. I mean, Trump was also very erratic in the way he was behaving in the Middle East, mainly with Iran, and he almost reached a war with Iran in 2018-20. So I'm not 100% optimistic in this case, because anything can happen, and so far we don't know if diplomatic relations will still be restored. I mean, we only saw that there was a roadmap that is driving to reopening embassies, but so far we don't know if this is going to happen. So we still need to wait 1 or 2 months to see if this is reaching a good end. I leave it now here, so if we can.
Great. Thanks, Luciano, and also thanks for alluding to the position of the previous U.S. administration. And we want to also contrast it with the current U.S. administration. So I want to now ask Anna perhaps to have some input on some of the reactions coming from DC to this deal.
Hi, yes, thank you all so much for having me. This has been wonderful. I actually just came back from Riyadh, but I have also been trying to follow as much as possible the reactions from Washington. You know, I think it's really important to highlight that, I mean, the reaction from the US, as everyone else has kind of alluded to, has been pretty lukewarm, I would say. You know, they cautiously welcomed it, but I think seemed very skeptical about whether or not it would actually happen. I think we all are, you know, cautiously optimistic. You know, I think in general, they will always say they support diplomacy that leads to de-escalation in the region. There are, of course, political groups in Washington that are totally anti any sort of diplomacy with Iran. But this administration did seem to cautiously welcome it. And I think that's genuine. I do think it was a surprise. I think it was a surprise for the Israelis. I think it was a surprise for the US. And I think even if the Saudis kept them in the loop about talks, I think the shock was that an agreement actually happened. You know, I think there could be some concern from the US that GCC countries normalizing with Iran could lead to, you know, greater economic ties with Iran, which would then, of course, lead to some issues with US sanctions, which are already a major issue for the UAE. But I think that there's maybe a concern that this would turn into a larger problem. You know, so I think that there's some concern, as others have raised, about this diplomacy with Iran without a resolution on the nuclear issue. I think that there's definitely an argument to be made that it could help with it, but I think the US had in mind JCPOA and then regional diplomacy after that. So I think that there's a bit of a concern about how this is happening now. The other point I want to make is, I mean, the US administration, I think, could be reading it in a similar way to how they read the OPEC Plus decision in October and Saudi-Russia cooperation on that front, meaning that the US may be thinking that Saudi's trying to send them a message of, you know, strategic autonomy, hedging, non-alignment, all of that. I mean, basically that Saudi doesn't need the US the way that it did before. I mean, my view is that this reading is off, but I do think that there are many in Washington who are reading it in that way. Of course, I mean, as others have said, I mean, the role of China is, of course, you know, of most concern to the US. But again, I mean, the US could never have played this role. They could never have brokered this type of agreement. It has, you know, it does not speak directly with Iran. You know, Saudi and Iran, for their own reasons, which others have laid out, you know, China was really the only global power that could help mediate at this point. And again, my understanding understanding from conversations in Riyadh is that, they wanted a global power to act as a political guarantor. And I think this is really what is crucial. And while the talks in Iraq and Oman were absolutely crucial, I think that set everything up very nicely, but I don't think that they could have, played that kind of role. So of course, the US is probably not happy, nervous, anxious that China is increasing its role in the region. And obviously taking part in, power projection outside of the economic domain and entering more into a political one like conflict resolution efforts. And then my very last point is, it's also important to remember that much of US diplomacy has not really focused on actively supporting GCC Iran reconciliation, but rather it's focused on the nuclear issue, at least previously, and on supporting Israeli normalization with countries like Saudi Arabia. And also, supporting the concept of, this Middle East NATO, which, in many ways was meant to act as sort of a firewall against Iran. So the US, may be cautiously welcoming the agreement to help with de-escalation, but they can't really hide the fact that it wasn't a top priority for them, and that it was, I think, a bit of a surprise to Israel and to the US. So, and I'll end it there. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And you also bring up the point of that came up many times, of the guarantor of this deal, China, and what does that actually mean, and how durable is that guarantee? So I think we'll have to unpack that a bit more. But before we do that, I want to go to you, Joseph. Obviously, there are many moving parts for this deal and many areas, but one of them definitely is Lebanon and Hezbollah's oversized role there, supported by Iran. How do you think, I'll ask you two questions. How do you think this deal will have an impact on Hezbollah? And the second question is actually from the audience, and so it's a fantastic question. They're asking that Bashar al-Assad was actually in the UAE for the first time in a long time. How do you think that the deal between Saudi and Iran will have an impact on Saudi Arabia? Do you think a normalization, that the deal is a first step towards normalization between Saudi and Syria? The floor is yours. You're on mute.
Yes, thank you, Adel. I think these questions are interrelated, but they boil down to mainly one question that we already raised. Within the framework of this agreement or this deal, which is phased once again. I mean, I said it, it's Yemen first, and then it's a testing ground. Yemen is not only first, but it is the theater where both parties will test the goodwill and the ability of that deal to sustain and to consolidate. After that, the question will become, what is the part and role of Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon in this deal? And this is where we can understand what's the effect on Hezbollah, what will be the future of Lebanon regarding this deal, etc., etc. Let me try to answer this question on Lebanon. First of all, I mean, besides the fact that as I just said, Lebanon is at the tail of the train. It's the last wagon of the train, so it will have to wait. However, like many times in Lebanon, the hours after the deal, all parties in Lebanon jumped to try to read this deal and to try to say that they have in fact won the game in Lebanon because of that deal. And this was very funny in a way. I mean, funny notwithstanding the very sad situation of the country. The camp that is close to Hezbollah, let's say now in the rift in Lebanon, which is mainly focused on the presidency, considered that now that Saudi and Iran are on the same page, Saudi Arabia will accept the candidate of Hezbollah in Lebanon in a sort of bargain that could say that Yemen is the utmost important file for Saudi Arabia. So if it takes whatever it wants in Yemen, it will concede whatever Iran wants in Lebanon. I think today this is proven to be completely wrong. The other camp also said, oh, now this is a complete tradition of Iran on regional issues because Iran is encircled. It needed this deal in order to get out of its isolation. So it needs money, it needs Arab embracement. So it will accept completely the conditions of Saudi Arabia and Lebanon. We will have a president that is completely aligned on Saudis, Americans, etc., with the nuances that exist in that camp. Today, also, this is proven wrong, and all this is proven to be completely, complete and classical Lebanese, let's say, over-fantasizing about things. What is sure now is that the presidency, which is the first and foremost factor on which such a deal could have an impact, is today, let's say, postponed, to be prudent. It is postponed because both parties and all players, even external players like France and the US and others that are meeting in Paris in order to find a solution for the presidency issue, will wait and see how this deal will translate on the ground in reality and then will be reverberated in Lebanon. This is the first point. The second point, I don't know, maybe Dr. Abbas will disagree a little bit, but also Iran has agreed or at least has embarked on that deal because in a way or another, in theaters like in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq, I think it has achieved almost the goals that they wanted. In Lebanon, for example, they are today dominating the political spectrum. They are dominating the political game, but, and this is the most important, they are not able to translate this domination into a governance that makes sense and that is viable. This is where probably they need also the Saudis, and this is where the Saudis have a strong leverage. It means that on the financial level, in a country that is today completely collapsing, if Lebanon has any chance to see one penny in the coming years, everybody knows that this has to do with a sort of Western slash IMF plus Saudi slash Gulfi opening towards the country. Hezbollah knows it, others knows it, and this is where the bargaining, I think, will occur. Now, the last and most probably sensitive point, will this deal mean that tomorrow, in the coming future, Hezbollah will disarm and completely abandon the rhetoric of resistance and etc.? I think this is very far-fetched. I think that if something has to translate in Lebanon, it will be probably a way to integrate Hezbollah more firmly, but more shrewdly maybe, in the institution of the country, a little bit like it is the case in Iraq and elsewhere. I'm keeping aside the question of Syria. Syria is notably making a comeback with or without this deal. The normalization towards Syria was already on the way. Before the earthquake, after the earthquake, I think without taking a crazy bet that Syria will reintegrate the Arab League in the maybe 24 months to come. And Syria is coming also to Lebanon. We can see it, we can perceive it. By the way, the candidate that is supported today by Hezbollah and Amal is the personal intimate friend of Bashar al-Assad, Salman Frangieh. He's the buddy, he's the childhood friend of Bashar al-Assad, and accepting Salman Frangieh as a president is not only a victory for Iran and Hezbollah, but it is a huge prize given to Bashar al-Assad in Lebanon, which I think certain countries that are supposedly helping on this file should keep in mind. Now, a last word, since we have mentioned the spoilers. Probably in Lebanon, this is where the American actor, if it is a spoiler on that deal, and I already said that it's not completely sure that the US is harmed by that deal because it has a lot of fringe benefit by the de-escalation and etc. But if it feels sidelined and cornered, Lebanon is probably one of the best places for the US to answer and to retaliate. They can block the presidency if the deal is not to their taste. They can play on certain forces that are still very, let's say, not obedient, but close to them. They still have the upper hand on the Lebanese army, and they also know that no IMF deal will be possible without an American green light. This is where I think, if I answer you on Lebanon, I would say that the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement is a huge step forward. It can help solve the Lebanese issue. It will need time, and at one point, I think, it will need an American buy-in, and this is where the famous Paris meeting of five powers could become important, provided that France also stops trying to impose certain choices that are very far from reality in Lebanon, like, for example, supporting Sleiman Frangi or any other candidate of that sort. On that level, since I'm mentioning France, an interesting note, the Baghdad format that was the prelude to what happened in Beijing was under the auspice of Emmanuel Macron. France played an important role in bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. I think this is an encouraging sign for the French diplomacy. However, France should also keep something in mind. If now there's a direct channel of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, probably they won't need France anymore. China will play the game, and also they will do that on a one-to-one basis. They can very easily tomorrow, if they want, Saudi Arabia and Iran sit together and solve together the question of the presidency in Lebanon, provided they have a buy-in from the United States. And I think this is something also that other players on Lebanon should keep in mind.
Great, thanks, Joseph. Faisal, I want to go to you now on another hot button issue, of course, Yemen. So I want you to just tell me, how do you think the negotiations would, and how this deal would impact the current negotiations, and how durable would, and what do the Saudis want out of Yemen specifically? I also have a second question from the audience. One of the audience members asking, what does Mr. Abbas think there will be repercussions from Saudi if the deal fails? Escalation. I think the two questions are connected. So please, 5 minutes, because we want to leave some time for our panel and then the questions as well.
Of course, thank you, Dr. Adel. First of all, I think in the terms of the Saudi priorities, I don't think I'll be telling you a secret if I say it's the top priority, Yemen. You know, back to the points I mentioned earlier, the Saudi source that spoke recently, revealing parts of the deal, did say the first pillar of the deal was the mutual respect for regional sovereign nations. And when we had an opportunity to dwell a little bit on what that means in terms of Yemen, what my understanding is that both parties have agreed to do every effort possible to sustain the ongoing truce, which has lasted now for 10 months, the longest since the conflict has started, and do every effort possible to achieve a lasting peace between the warring parties in Yemen. And, you know, this is somebody who's a senior Saudi official. So I wouldn't be surprised that he has chosen his language, his words carefully. This shows that there is a respect to the parties on the ground, and every effort in terms of leverage, in terms of resourcing, to help achieve a lasting peace in Yemen. Now, you have to take, you know, I've been covering the Yemen war since day one, and we also have to remember that the Iranians, you know, they are shrewd and smart, and they will never put themselves in a public position where they will admit any international violation of the law, or deliberately overthrowing a UN-recognized government in another country. So there is that element to think about, that the words are chosen carefully. But I can tell you with full confidence that, if Yemen was not on the table, and if this doesn't mean that Yemen was going to be solved, then I think the Saudi interest in the deal would diminish. Interestingly, on the same day or the following day, the Houthis came out with a very reassuring message that they welcome the deal and they're looking forward to what it means in terms of Yemen. So that's a very reassuring message. I think from Saudi rhetoric over the past few years, I think we've shifted gears from the beginning of the war towards that the Houthis are an element of the Yemeni society, and we need to discuss with them, and the government, the legitimate government of Yemen, needs to achieve an agreement with them. That, I believe, is the more pragmatic, more rational, more productive way of doing it. But because you don't want to leave somebody cornered without saving face, and that goes for all conflicts. Now, the question on the consequences of Iran not respecting the deal, two things. It's not going to get any worse than what we've already been facing for the last 40 years, and particularly in the last few years. So, the Iran and its militias or its affiliates have already targeted Saudi civilians, have already targeted civilian airports, have already targeted cities. They're already in surrounding countries, controlling them. They are already doing destabilizing activities. And, we've had 40 years of investment in offsetting this Iranian malign activity through intelligence, through military, through cybersecurity. So, I think my own belief is that we enter these talks saying, we have everything to win and nothing to lose. Because if the Iranians do not respect this deal, then we're just going to go back to the way we were 10 days ago, which we have 40 years of experience of doing. It's not ideal, but at the same time, winning it all is definitely, for the reasons I outlined in the beginning, definitely worth this pursuit, and definitely giving peace every chance possible, because we have a lot to protect. Now, the Iranians, on the other hand, they have a lot to lose if they don't stick to the deal, or the deal doesn't stick. As I said, they don't really have a lot of friends in the international community. The Russians have their hands full. The Chinese have massive investments in China. They have big interests with Beijing. They don't want to upset a beast, a monster of in terms of size and magnitude, such as China, with that much investment into Iran. And I think I will leave it there. And I can't remember if there was a third question, but I think I've answered everything, Dr. Adil.
We have 25 questions, so we'll get back to the audience. We'll try our best. I actually want to switch the order now and just go to Anna, because I know, Anna, you recently were in Saudi and you've been following closely the Yemen issue as well. What are your some of your reactions? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I also just want to say too, the Yemen truce expired in October of last year. So what they're actually working on, from what I know, is trying to renew that. The truce, even if it officially expired, has remained technically in place, which is very positive. And, I also think, my view is that actually dynamics in Yemen can partially explain some of the timing on this deal, because, the Saudi Houthi talks have been happening for months now. There are obviously major points of friction, but my understanding is that they have progressed in a positive way up through the end of last year. So I also think that helped sort of facilitate this agreement now. The other thing is, I thought it was interesting that after the agreement was announced, the Houthis are from what I read and heard, they actually made a major point to sort of assert their autonomy from Iran, and made a very clear point to also say, we do not have a command and control relationship with Iran, and we will decide how to act based on us, right? So I thought it was quite interesting that the Houthis made a point in communicating that right afterwards. But then yesterday, the prisoner swap that was announced was huge. It was hundreds of people. And while that was in progress before the agreement was announced, I think the deal probably helped it along. So I think that we are actually already seeing some positive sort of benefits of this. But again, I also think that the dynamics within Yemen could help us understand the timeline of it all somewhat. And just if I may, one really, really quick point about the timeline and some of what I heard in Riyadh last week. Interestingly, what I heard was that it was China who reached out during the summit in December and offered. So and then soon after that, when China hosted Raisi, I think that message was passed along. So this is what I was told in terms of the timing of all of this. And the other thing that I thought was quite interesting is that, we were also told that, again, the last round of official talks happened in April of last year. That's almost, that's months ago now, and that not much happened after that. The Baghdad conference, obviously in December, the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers met on the sidelines of that, but I understood that wasn't a terribly substantive meeting. And then they met again, or some of these officials met in January also. So at least the narrative that I heard from officials in Riyadh really was that there wasn't much movement on this front from April of last year through, I would say, December, and then a lot happened. But again, I thought it was interesting that that their messaging is that China was the one that offered, that Saudi did not ask them, and that Iran did